History does not begin with crowns. It begins with silence. Before the names of kings were carved into stone, before borders were drawn, before empires called themselves eternal, there were rooms no one wrote about. Rooms with locked doors. Rooms where history stopped recording. This story begins there. Not in triumph, not in glory, but in absence. Because across time, across continents, across civilizations that never met and never spoke, the same pattern emerged again and again. Power took bodies. And when power could not be challenged, it took them completely. This is not a story about sex. It is a story about ownership. And ownership, when it is absolute, does not ask for consent. We are taught to remember empires by their achievements, their architecture, their laws, their art, their victories, but empires are not built only with stone and steel. They are built with people. And some people, especially women, were never meant to be remembered as people at all. They were meant to disappear. Imagine conquest not as a heroic charge, but as what comes after. The city falls, the walls are broken, the defenders are gone, fires still burn. The ground is littered with what used to be ordinary life, and then comes the sorting. Men are separated from women, children are pulled from arms, families dissolve in moments, names lose meaning, some captives are killed, some are forced to labor, some are chained and marched away, and some quietly, deliberately are set aside. They are not chosen for strength. They are not chosen for skill. They are chosen because they can be owned in the most intimate way possible. Their future is decided before they understand what has happened. History calls this spoils of war. That phrase hides everything. From this moment onward, their lives are no longer theirs. They are transported, traded, gifted, sold. They pass through hands that never ask who they were before. They are renamed or not named at all. They are evaluated not by character, but by age, appearance, and origin. They are placed behind walls, and behind those walls, history grows quiet. Every empire claimed it was different. Every empire insisted it was civilized. Every empire told itself stories to justify what it did. Yet across centuries, the same structure appears. Rulers surrounded themselves with women they did not marry, women who had no legal voice, women who could not refuse, women whose survival depended on obedience. These women were called many things: concubines, handmaids, court women, servants, but names do not change reality. They were enslaved. Why did this happen everywhere? Not because all rulers were the same men, not because all cultures were identical, but because power, when left unchecked, follows predictable paths. When someone controls life and death, they soon seek control without consequences. When someone owns land and labor, they eventually claim bodies. When someone rules without accountability, intimacy becomes another form of domination. This was not an accident of history, it was a feature. Sexual slavery did not exist on the margins of empire. It existed at the center. It was organized, regulated, managed. Markets existed for human bodies. Prices were standardized. Ethnic origins were ranked. Youth was monetized. Officials supervised transactions. States collected taxes. Laws debated conditions, not morality. This was not chaos. This was governance. And the most powerful men in these systems did not hide what they owned. Their households were symbols of status. Their private quarters were political spaces. Access to them meant influence. Favor meant survival. Within these spaces, women lived under constant surveillance. Their movement was restricted. Their speech was monitored. Their relationships were controlled. They were isolated from the outside world and often from each other. Isolation was not incidental, it prevented resistance. We are often shown romanticized images of these spaces. Soft fabrics, music, luxury, leisure, but luxury does not cancel captivity. A gilded cage is still a cage. The women inside these systems were not passive ornaments. They navigated fear, competition, and uncertainty every day. Some learned languages, some memorized etiquette, some understood politics better than the men who ruled them. But intelligence did not grant freedom. At best, it offered survival. A few women rose in influence. History remembers them as exceptions, favorites, mothers of heirs, powerful figures behind the scenes. But focusing on exceptions is how systems protect themselves. For every woman remembered, thousands were erased. Their stories ended without record. Their deaths went unmarked. Their names dissolved into anonymity. This is not because their lives were unimportant. It is because their lives were inconvenient to remember. There are almost no first-person accounts from these women, not because they had nothing to say, but because writing required permission, education required access, survival required silence, and silence was enforced. History often treats this silence as absence. It is not. It is evidence. Evidence of who was allowed to speak. Evidence of whose suffering mattered. Evidence of how power controlled not only bodies but memory. Sexual slavery served many purposes for those in power. It reinforced dominance over conquered populations. It provided sexual access without legal obligation. It ensured heirs without shared authority. It displayed victory as possession. Marriage created alliances and limits. Enslavement created dependency and control. This system also relied on dehumanization. Women were reduced to categories. Foreignness was exaggerated. Difference was emphasized. The more distant they seemed, the easier they were to own. Language played a role. Violence became custom. Captivity became service. Rape became favor. Words softened reality until reality became invisible, and society accepted it because acceptance did not require participation, only silence. Most people were not in palaces. Most people were not powerful, but many benefited indirectly. Markets thrived. Wars enriched. Hierarchies stabilized. Opposition was rare, not because people did not know, but because knowing did not change power. This is one of the hardest truths to confront. Sexual slavery endured not because humanity failed to understand its cruelty, but because too many systems relied on it. Empires are not built by accident. They are built by choices, repeated, normalized, defended. We often ask why ancient people did not know better, but knowledge is not the same as power, and empathy is not the same as action. This documentary does not seek to shock, it seeks to clarify, to show how patterns repeat when conditions remain the same, when conquest is rewarded, when inequality is justified, when bodies are treated as resources. Modern human trafficking did not appear suddenly. It inherited roots. It inherited logic. It inherited excuses. Only the language changed. To understand the present, we must stop mythologizing the past. We must stop calling exploitation tradition. We must stop confusing endurance with acceptance. The women whose lives were consumed by these systems were not symbols. They were human beings. They had families, memories, fear, hope. They laughed once. They resisted in small ways. They survived longer than expected or did not. History did not record them, but history was shaped by what was done to them. Every empire carried this contradiction. It spoke of order while practicing domination. It praised morality while enforcing silence. It celebrated legacy while erasing lives. This story is not about condemning one culture, one religion, or one era. It is about examining what happens when power is allowed to define humanity. The question is not why empires behave this way. The question is why humanity tolerated it for so long. Because systems do not survive without participation. They survive through normalization, through distraction, through forgetting. This documentary begins by remembering, not individual names we no longer have, but the structure that consumed them. Because if we do not understand how ordinary cruelty becomes invisible, we will fail to recognize it when it wears new forms. Behind every great empire was a population whose suffering was hidden to protect the image of greatness. Behind every golden age was a cost paid in silence. This is where the story begins, not with heroes, but with truth. And once the silence is broken, it cannot be unbroken. Silence once broken does not disappear quietly. It echoes, and echoes force questions. Who benefited from this silence? Who maintained it? And who paid for it with their lives, their bodies, their futures? Because silence is never neutral, it is curated. To understand how this silence survived for centuries, we must understand how violence learned to disguise itself as order. Empires did not describe what they were doing as cruelty. They described it as stability, as tradition, as the natural arrangement of the world. Power prefers inevitability. If something feels inevitable, it feels unquestionable. And so sexual slavery was framed not as abuse but as structure. From a distance, empire looks organized, clean lines on maps, columns and palaces, laws etched in stone. But organization does not imply justice. In fact, the more organized a system becomes, the easier it is to hide harm within it. There were rules governing enslaved women. Rules about behavior, rules about punishment, rules about access. Rules made violence feel procedural. If something is regulated, it feels controlled. If it is controlled, it feels acceptable. If it is acceptable, it no longer feels violent. This is how cruelty becomes invisible. Consider the idea of consent in a world where refusal meant death, starvation, or further punishment. Consent requires choice. Choice requires power. These women had neither, yet history often speaks as if they did. It speaks of favor, of affection, of intimacy, as if imbalance could ever produce mutuality. We must be careful here not to project modern language carelessly onto the past, but also not to excuse the past by pretending morality did not exist. People understood suffering. People understood coercion. People understood fear. What they lacked was incentive to stop it. Empires thrive on hierarchy. Someone must be above. Someone must be below. And when hierarchy becomes naturalized, exploitation feels justified. Those at the top convince themselves they are entitled. Those below are taught they are replaceable. Sexual slavery was not only about women. It was also about men proving dominance over other men. To take women from conquered populations was to announce victory not just over armies, but over lineage, honor, and future generations. It said, "Your bloodline is now under my control." This is why sexual slavery follows conquest so reliably. It is not incidental violence. It is symbolic domination, and symbols matter. They shape how power is understood. They teach societies what is acceptable. They normalize inequality at the most intimate level. Children born from these systems occupied uncertain positions, Some were acknowledged, some were erased. Some were raised within palaces and groomed for power. Others were discarded, sold, or hidden. Their existence was conditional. Their mother's humanity was negotiable. Even motherhood did not guarantee protection. Affection could fade, favor could shift, influence could vanish overnight, and when protection disappeared, so did safety. The constant instability was not accidental. It kept women divided. It prevented unity. It turned survival into competition. When people are forced to compete for basic safety, resistance becomes nearly impossible. This is how systems protect themselves. History often celebrates political intrigue within palaces, rivalries, plots, power struggles. What it rarely acknowledges is the environment that made such intrigue inevitable. When survival depends on proximity to power, power becomes everything. We should also confront another myth, that these systems were isolated to royalty. They were not. Elites emulated rulers. Officials copied courts. Wealthy households adopted similar arrangements. What began at the top filtered downward. Normalization spreads. Markets adapted to demand. Merchants specialized. Routes expanded. Trafficking networks stabilized. Entire economies adjusted around the trade in human bodies. This is not hyperbole. It is documentation. Yet despite all this, resistance existed. It just rarely looked like rebellion. It looked like survival. Small acts, quiet refusals, hidden solidarities, passing knowledge, sharing warnings, protecting each other when possible. Resistance does not always announce itself. Sometimes it endures, but endurance should not be mistaken for acceptance. Survival is not consent. One of the most dangerous distortions of history is the idea that because something lasted, it must have been tolerable. Longevity does not equal legitimacy. It often equals suppression. We must also understand the role of storytelling. Empires told stories about themselves, stories of greatness, stories of divine approval, stories of order over chaos. These stories required erasure, because acknowledging mass sexual enslavement would fracture the image of moral authority, so it was reframed, or ignored, or aestheticized. Art played a role. Paintings softened reality. Poetry romanticized captivity. Architecture impressed awe. Beauty distracted from brutality. This is not accidental. Culture can anesthetize conscience. And later generations inherited these stories without interrogating their foundations. We grew up admiring ruins without asking who suffered to maintain them. We memorized names of rulers without asking who paid the price for their leisure. We absorbed the silence. This documentary exists to interrupt that inheritance, not to assign guilt across centuries, but to assign responsibility in the present to look honestly without nostalgia. Because when we say that was normal back then, we are not stating a fact. We are making a choice to accept power's version of history. The truth is more unsettling. People knew, people debated, people justified, moral discomfort existed. It was simply outweighed by benefit. This brings us to a critical realization. The greatest protection sexual slavery had was not ignorance. It was usefulness. As long as systems profit from inequality, inequality finds justification. As long as domination stabilizes power, domination is defended. As long as bodies can be owned, someone will argue they should be. This is not ancient history. It is a pattern. When we examine modern forms of exploitation, the similarities are uncomfortable. Recruitment through vulnerability, isolation from support networks, control through debt, fear, and dependency, language that disguises coercion as opportunity. Only the aesthetics have changed. This is why understanding the past matters, not to linger in horror, but to recognize continuity. If we do not name what sexual slavery was in empires was, we risk misunderstanding what it becomes. If we romanticize power, we excuse its abuses. If we inherit silence, we reproduce it. This story is difficult because it destabilizes familiar narratives. It challenges the idea that progress is inevitable. It forces us to see civilization not only as achievement but as compromise. And yet, this reckoning is necessary, because history is not only about what happened. It is about what we choose to remember. The women erased from imperial records are not gone. They exist in consequences, in structures that persist, in inequalities that remain, in systems that echo old logic. When we tell their story not as individuals we can no longer name, but as a collective reality, we restore something stolen, not justice, but recognition. Recognition is the beginning of accountability. This documentary will move deeper, into markets and laws, into roots and records, into institutions and justifications. It will not look away. But before we go further, we must sit with this truth. Empires were not only built on land and labor, they were built on silence. And silence, once understood, becomes impossible to ignore. This is not the end of the beginning. It is the beginning of seeing clearly. And clarity is always unsettling. Because once you understand how normalized cruelty becomes invisible, you begin to recognize it everywhere. And once you recognize it, you can no longer pretend it is history alone. Listening changes things. Because once silence becomes audible, it stops being background noise and starts becoming accusation. It asks something of us. When power controls history, it decides not only what is remembered, but what is considered normal. And nothing protects injustice more effectively than normality. When something is routine, it disappears from moral focus. When it disappears, it survives. This is how sexual slavery lived so long, by becoming ordinary. Consider how quickly societies adapt to inequality. At first, violence shocks, then it disturbs, then it is explained, then it is managed, then it is inherited. Soon, no one remembers a world without it. Children are born into systems already shaped. They grow up learning where they belong, what they can expect, and what they must endure. By the time they are old enough to question it, the system feels immovable. This is how injustice becomes tradition. Empires depended on this process. Because domination cannot rely on force alone. Force is expensive. Resistance is constant. Normalization is cheaper. If people believe something is the natural order of the world, they enforce it themselves. Women inside sexual slavery systems were taught this lesson early. They learned which emotions were dangerous, which questions were forbidden, which hopes were unrealistic. They learned to read rooms, moods, silences. They learned that survival required awareness, not freedom. We often imagine resistance as loud and heroic, but in environments of total control, resistance becomes quiet. It becomes endurance. It becomes adaptation. It becomes staying alive one more day. And while these women were erased from official records, their presence shaped power itself. They influenced succession. They altered alliances. They changed outcomes, sometimes subtly, sometimes decisively. Yet even when they altered history, history refused to name them. Power accepted their usefulness but denied their humanity. This contradiction lies at the heart of empire. Empires demanded loyalty from those they enslaved while offering none in return. They demanded obedience while practicing exploitation. They demanded silence while speaking endlessly about greatness. This is why the study of sexual slavery unsettles imperial myths, because it reveals how fragile those myths are. Strip away the pageantry and what remains is coercion organized at scale. It is tempting to believe that moral progress is linear, that the past was cruel and the present is enlightened. But history does not move in straight lines. It loops. It adapts. It disguises itself. Systems rarely vanish completely. They evolve. They change language. They change laws. They change appearance. But their core logic often survives. The logic is simple. Some lives are valued more than others. Some bodies exist to serve power. Some suffering is acceptable. As long as this logic persists, history remains unfinished. This documentary does not offer comfort. It offers recognition. Recognition that civilization and cruelty often advance together. Recognition that beauty and brutality are not opposites. Recognition that silence is not neutrality, it is participation. We must also confront another discomforting truth. Empires did not collapse because of sexual slavery. They collapsed for other reasons: economics, war, internal conflict. Sexual slavery survived those collapses. It moved on. When one empire fell, its practices migrated. They were adopted, adapted, rebranded. New rulers inherited old systems. They justified them with new words. This continuity challenges the idea that exploitation belongs to the past. It suggests something more troubling, that when conditions allow, humanity repeats itself, which brings us to responsibility. Not inherited guilt, but inherited awareness. We are not accountable for what was done centuries ago, but we are accountable for what we choose to ignore now. Understanding history is not about self-blame. It is about pattern recognition. Because once you see the pattern, you see how easily it returns. Whenever war creates displacement, whenever inequality creates vulnerability, whenever power concentrates without oversight, the conditions reappear, and with them the same abuses. This is why telling this story matters. Not as spectacle, not as tragedy porn, but as analysis. Because analysis disrupts repetition. The women erased by empire were not powerless because they were weak. They were powerless because systems were designed to overpower them. This distinction matters. It shifts blame from individuals to structures, and structures can be dismantled if they are seen clearly. Seeing clearly requires discomfort. It requires letting go of romanticized pasts. It requires admitting that greatness often rested on suffering. But there is another reason this story matters. Empires fall. Power shifts. But the people erased by history remain erased unless someone chooses to remember them. Memory is not automatic. It is an act. This documentary is an act of refusal, a refusal to let silence masquerade as innocence, a refusal to let power define morality, a refusal to let erased lives vanish completely. We cannot give these women justice, but we can give them truth. And truth, while incomplete, is not nothing. As we move forward, we will name mechanisms. We will trace roots. We will examine laws, markets, and institutions. We will look at how something so violent became so ordinary, but we will never forget what this is really about. not numbers, not systems, not empires, people, people who were denied choice, people who were denied voice, people who were denied memory. History often asks us to admire power. This documentary asks us to question it, because only when power is questioned does silence lose its grip. And only when silence is broken does repetition become avoidable. This is not where the story ends. It is where the descent deepens. And once you descend far enough, you begin to understand how carefully constructed the surface always was. Exposure changes perspective. Once you see how silence is built, you begin to notice how carefully it is maintained. Silence does not survive on its own. It requires protection. It requires repetition. It requires people willing to look away. And empires were very good at teaching people where not to look. The most effective systems of control do not rely on constant violence. They rely on predictability. If punishment is predictable, fear becomes internal. If reward is unpredictable, hope becomes manipulation. This balance kept women compliant without chains most of the time, because chains were visible, fear was not. Inside imperial households, time itself was controlled. Days blurred together. Seasons passed unnoticed. Life became measured not by years but by access. Access to food, access to protection, access to favor. When time loses structure, resistance loses momentum. Many of these women entered captivity very young, before they understood politics, before they understood sexuality, before they understood the permanence of what had been done to them. They learned fast because learning was survival. Training replaced childhood. They were taught how to walk, how to speak, how to lower their eyes, how to smile at the right moment. Their bodies were disciplined before their minds could rebel. This was not accidental. Control is easiest before identity fully forms. And yet, even under such control, humanity does not vanish. Fear coexists with longing. Obedience coexists with memory. Adaptation coexists with grief. People do not stop being human because systems wish them to. They simply stop being visible. This invisibility served power well. Because invisible suffering does not provoke outrage. It provokes curiosity at best, indifference at worst. We must confront how easily fascination replaces empathy. Stories of harems, concubines, court women. These are often told with intrigue, mystery, even envy. But fascination is a form of distance. It turns coercion into spectacle, and spectacle neutralizes moral response. This is why the past is often presented as exotic. Exoticism makes cruelty feel foreign. If it feels foreign, it feels irrelevant. If it feels irrelevant, it feels safe to ignore. But there is nothing exotic about domination. There is nothing cultural about coercion. There is nothing traditional about treating people as property. These are choices, repeated choices. Empires made those choices because they worked. They consolidated power. They rewarded loyalty. They intimidated enemies. They satisfied entitlement. The human cost was simply externalized. Externalization is key. As long as suffering happens behind walls, beyond borders, or to people labeled as other, it does not register as a crisis. It registers as background. This is why sexual slavery thrived in spaces of separation. Foreign captives, isolated compounds, restricted movement. Distance dulls responsibility. And yet distance is an illusion, because the effects of these systems did not stay contained. They shaped gender roles. They shaped inheritance laws. They shaped ideas about women's bodies and worth. They shaped the future. Many assumptions that later societies inherited about women, obedience, availability, disposability, were reinforced in these systems. Not invented there, but institutionalized there. This is why the legacy matters, because legacies do not announce themselves. They hide in norms. When we say, "This is how it has always been," we are often repeating the aftermath of someone else's suffering. When we say, "This is tradition," we are often naming survival strategies mistaken for consent. The past is not past because time passed. The past is past only when its logic is dismantled. This documentary does not aim to indict individuals long dead. It aims to expose the machinery that outlived them, because machinery can be rebuilt, and often is. There is another illusion worth dismantling, the idea that power corrupted otherwise moral people. Power does not corrupt in isolation. It reveals incentives. If a system rewards exploitation, exploitation will occur regardless of personal virtue. This is why moral character alone cannot prevent abuse. Only accountability can, and accountability was absent. Those with absolute power answered to no one. Those without power were not considered answers. This imbalance created a world where suffering could be justified, managed, and forgotten. Forgotten intentionally. But forgetting is not passive. It is an act of preservation. Preservation of comfort, preservation of image, preservation of authority. To remember differently is disruptive. It destabilizes inherited pride. It complicates simple narratives. It asks uncomfortable questions. That is why remembering is resisted. As we move forward, the story will become more concrete. We will leave abstraction. We will examine how this system functioned day by day, how bodies moved through it, how money flowed, how laws protected it. But before we do, we must sit with one final truth of this opening. Sexual slavery was not hidden because it was rare. It was hidden because it was common. What is common rarely feels urgent. What feels ordinary rarely feels wrong. This is how injustice survives centuries. Breaking this spell requires attention, sustained attention, not outrage that burns quickly, but understanding that endures. That is the purpose of this beginning. Not to overwhelm, but to prepare. Because once the mechanisms are revealed, they cannot be unseen. And once they cannot be unseen, silence loses its power. We move next into the structure itself. How conquest turned into commerce. How bodies became inventory. How empire learned to profit from intimacy. Specificity changes everything. Because abstraction allows distance, specifics remove it. Once we begin to trace how this system actually functioned, step by step, decision by decision, it stops being an unfortunate byproduct of history and becomes what it truly was, a deliberate process. Nothing about sexual slavery in empires was spontaneous. It did not rely on impulse. It did not rely on chaos. It relied on planning. After conquest came assessment. Captives were not treated equally. They were sorted. Age was noted. Health was inspected. Origins were recorded. Difference mattered. Foreignness increased value. Isolation increased control. Those with no local ties were easier to own. Transport followed. Long marches, crowded ships, guarded caravans. Movement itself became a tool of domination. Disorientation broke resistance. Fatigue erased protest. Distance severed hope of return. By the time many arrived, escape was no longer imaginable. Arrival did not mean safety. It meant evaluation. Bodies were examined not for well-being but for market value. This was not hidden, it was normalized. Once inside elite households, the rules changed, but freedom did not arrive. Instead, captivity became regulated. Daily routines replaced chains. Surveillance replaced force. Control became quieter. Every detail of life was managed. When to wake, what to wear, where to stand, when to speak. Choice was eliminated so thoroughly that obedience became instinct. Punishment did not need to be constant. It only needed to be possible. Uncertainty did the rest. The women learned quickly what behavior was rewarded: silence, compliance, adaptability. They also learned what was dangerous: attachment, defiance, visibility. Visibility is a paradox in systems of power. To be noticed could mean protection. It could also mean destruction, favor elevated and endangered at the same time. This instability kept people compliant. Nothing about this was accidental. Instability prevents solidarity. When survival is individualized, collective resistance becomes nearly impossible. Some women were deliberately separated by language, culture, or rank. They could not easily communicate. They could not easily organize. Isolation was engineered. Even intimacy was controlled. Relationships between women were monitored. Pregnancies were regulated. Children were claimed by the system, not the mother. Motherhood did not equal autonomy. It increased vulnerability because children became assets. Potential heirs, potential threats, potential leverage, and leverage always belongs to power. This system also relied heavily on the idea of replacement. If one woman died, another could be acquired. If one resisted, another could be substituted. Replaceability is one of the most dehumanizing concepts a system can enforce. It tells people they are interchangeable, disposable. Disposable lives rarely receive protection. Yet even within this machinery, contradictions existed. Power depended on obedience, but also on desire. Desire is unstable. It creates favoritism. It creates jealousy. It creates unpredictability. Empires tried to manage this but could never fully control it. This tension created anxiety at the top. Rulers feared betrayal. They feared manipulation. They feared influence they could not fully command. So they tightened control further. More surveillance, more restrictions, more separation. Control feeds itself. What is often forgotten is that these systems harmed more than the enslaved. They deformed everyone involved. They taught rulers entitlement without empathy. They taught institutions to prioritize order over humanity. They taught societies to rationalize cruelty. When cruelty is rationalized, it becomes policy, and policy becomes legacy. This is why examining mechanisms matters, not to catalog suffering, but to understand how suffering becomes routine. At this point in the story, something important must be said clearly. Sexual slavery was not sustained by individual cruelty alone. It was sustained by bureaucracy. Records were kept. Inventories were updated. Transfers were authorized. Paperwork made violence administrative. Once violence is administrative, it feels distant, even to those ordering it. Bureaucracy allowed people to participate without confronting consequences. One person arranged transport. Another managed records. Another enforced rules. No single person felt responsible for the whole. This diffusion of responsibility protected the system. Systems thrive when accountability is fragmented. Over time, this machinery became self-perpetuating. People were born into it, Careers depended on it, stability relied on it, questioning it threatened livelihoods, so it remained unquestioned. This is how exploitation becomes institutional memory, passed down, refined, defended, and this brings us back to silence. Silence was not simply imposed from above. It was maintained from within, by people who benefited, by people who feared loss, by people who chose comfort over confrontation. Silence was easier than change. Understanding this does not excuse it, it explains it. An explanation is dangerous because it removes the mystery. Once something is understood, it can be dismantled. That is why this story matters, not because it is shocking, but because it is systematic. We are now prepared to move deeper, to examine the markets that fed this system, the roots that sustained it, the laws that protected it. This is where names, places, and transactions emerge, where abstraction becomes evidence. After arrival, after sorting, after assignment, life did not become static, it became managed. Every day followed routines designed not for well-being but for control. Wake times were fixed, movement was restricted, speech was observed, uncertainty was constant. Certainty was dangerous because certainty allows planning and planning allows resistance. Food was not just nourishment, it was leverage. Quality and quantity fluctuated according to obedience. Comfort became conditional. Even basic survival was politicized. When survival depends on approval, approval becomes power. Clothing was another tool. Dress codes reinforced hierarchy. Fabric, color, and ornamentation signaled rank. Clothing reminded women where they stood and who stood above them. Identity was stripped, then replaced with visual markers chosen by others. Names often changed. Original names were erased. New names were assigned or numbers. Renaming is not symbolic, it is functional. It disconnects a person from their past, their family, their sense of self. It tells them who you were no longer exists. Education, when provided, was selective. Some women were trained in music, poetry, etiquette, or languages, not for their enrichment, but to increase their usefulness. Education did not grant freedom, it increased value. Others were deliberately kept uneducated. Ignorance limited communication. Ignorance limited planning. Ignorance limited escape. This division prevented unity. Knowledge was rationed. The internal hierarchy was strict. Women were ranked against each other. Age, favor, function, competition was encouraged. When people compete for survival, they do not unite against power. They turn inward. Jealousy was not an accident. It was a strategy. Divide attention. Fragment loyalty. Prevent solidarity. A divided population is easier to control than a unified one. Surveillance was constant, not always obvious, often subtle. Eyes everywhere, ears everywhere. Trust was dangerous. Friendship could be reported. Whispers could be punished. Isolation was psychological, not just physical. Punishment varied. Sometimes it was immediate, sometimes delayed. Delay increased fear. Uncertainty is more powerful than pain. Rewards were equally calculated. Small privileges, temporary protection, moments of favor, just enough to keep hope alive. Hope, when controlled, becomes a leash. Sexual access itself was regulated. It was not spontaneous. It was scheduled, granted, withdrawn. Access was power. Refusal was not an option, but permission still mattered. Permission reinforced hierarchy. Pregnancy changed everything. A pregnant woman became both valuable and vulnerable. Her body now carried an asset. Her autonomy shrank further. Decisions about her child were no longer hers. Often they never had been. Children born into these systems belonged to the institution, not the mother. Their futures were decided early. Potential heir, potential pawn, potential liability. Motherhood did not restore humanity, it complicated exploitation. Some children were acknowledged, some were hidden, some were removed. Separation was common because attachment threatens control. Over time, many women internalized the rules, not because they believed in them, but because survival required fluency. They learned what could be said, what could be shown, what must be hidden. They learned to perform compliance. Performance is not consent, but systems rarely care about the difference. This environment reshaped identity. People adapt to survive. Adaptation can look like acceptance. History often mistakes the two. From the outside, these systems appeared stable, orderly, predictable, controlled, but inside they were volatile. Favor shifted quickly. Protection disappeared suddenly. Lives changed overnight. Nothing was permanent. This instability served power. When nothing is secure, no one feels safe enough to challenge authority. We must also understand the role of intermediaries, eunuchs, guards, administrators. They enforced rules. They monitored behavior. They were both powerful and constrained. They existed between ruler and captive, and they ensured distance. Distance protects power from empathy. Many of these intermediaries were themselves enslaved or marginalized. This layered oppression complicated accountability. Power delegated cruelty. Cruelty dispersed responsibility. The system did not require everyone to be cruel. It required everyone to play their role, and most did, because refusal had consequences. What we see here is not chaos. It is design. A design refined over generations, tested, adjusted, perfected. This is why sexual slavery persisted even when rulers changed, because the structure remained. Understanding this structure matters, because structures outlive individuals. They shape behavior long after intentions are forgotten. The women inside these systems were not naive. They understood the rules better than anyone. But understanding rules does not equal power to change them. History often judges people by their outcomes, but outcomes inside coercive systems are not choices. They are negotiations under threat. When a woman survived longer than others, history may call her cunning. What it rarely acknowledges is the violence she navigated daily. This is why moral judgment of individuals inside these systems is dangerous. It distracts from the system itself. The system is the story, and the system was built deliberately. As we move forward, we will widen the lens. We will follow supply lines backward, to the markets, to the raids, to the borders where people disappeared. Because no system like this survives without constant replenishment. Bodies were consumed, more were needed, and so the machinery kept turning. This is not background context. This is the core. Because once you understand how carefully exploitation was organized, you understand why it was so hard to end. The machinery did not begin inside palaces. It began far away from marble floors and guarded corridors, at borders, coastlines, forests, villages, and roads where people lived ordinary lives before history reached out and claimed them. To understand sexual slavery in empires, we must follow the system backward, not from the throne, but from the point of disappearance. Most women who entered these systems did not come from cities of power. They came from edges of empires, edges of maps, edges of protection. Borderlands where law was thin and violence was familiar. Frontiers where conquest never fully ended, it only paused. These regions were unstable by design. Empires expanded outward not to integrate equally but to extract taxes, labor, bodies. When resistance emerged, punishment followed. When punishment followed, captives were taken. And among captives, women were categorized early. Raids were efficient. They targeted villages at dawn. They struck during harvests. They attacked when men were away. Speed mattered. Confusion mattered. The goal was not battle, it was capture. Families were broken deliberately because intact families resist. Broken ones scatter. Scattering creates vulnerability. Women were bound, marched, or loaded onto ships. Many did not survive the journey. Those who did arrive changed. Hunger weakens defiance. Exhaustion dulls memory. Fear reshapes identity. By the time they reached markets or holding centers, resistance had already been eroded. Markets were not chaotic scenes of cruelty alone. They were organized, locations were known, dates were scheduled, prices fluctuated with supply and demand. Buyers inspected carefully. Age, teeth, skin, scars, bodies were evaluated like tools. The act of inspection was itself a form of domination. It taught captives how they were seen, not as people, as commodities. Merchants specialized. Some focused on transport, some on grooming, some on resale. There were middlemen. There were brokers. There were contracts. This trade connected distant regions. What began as a raid in one place could end in captivity thousands of miles away. Distance erased accountability. By the time a woman reached an imperial household, no one involved felt responsible for her capture. Responsibility had been diluted across geography and time. This is how systems protect themselves. Religion, law, and custom often intersected here, not to stop the trade, but to regulate it. Debates focused on ownership rights, treatment standards, and inheritance, not freedom. Moral concern was redirected. Once sold, women entered holding environments, training centers, transit households, court schools. These spaces prepared them for their final destination. Preparation was not kindness, it was conditioning. Language training limited communication to approved forms. Behavioral training taught submission. Punishment reinforced boundaries. This phase was crucial. It transformed captives into assets. Unpredictability became reliability. Resistance became liability. By the time women reached elite households, much of the violence had already been absorbed. The palace did not need to break them completely. Others had already done that work. This distance allowed rulers to perceive themselves as benevolent. They did not witness the raids. They did not see the marches. They did not hear the screams. They received a finished product. And so they told themselves stories. Stories are powerful. They allow people to live with contradiction. They allow cruelty without guilt. They allow pleasure without accountability. Inside palaces, this self-deception was reinforced. Luxury created illusion. Comfort masked coercion. Routine disguised captivity. Rulers spoke of protection, of generosity, of favor, as if choice existed. But choice requires alternatives, and alternatives did not exist. The longer women remained inside these systems, the more difficult escape became. Not just physically, psychologically, time eroded memory. Language changed, faces from the past blurred, hope became dangerous because hope reminds you of loss. Many learned to suppress it. This suppression is often mistaken for acceptance. It is not. It is survival. Survival reshapes identity. People learn who they must become to endure. That version may look complicit, but it is not free. History struggles to understand this. It prefers clear villains and clear victims, but systems create gray zones, zones where people adapt to violence because resistance is fatal. This complexity does not absolve the system, it indicts it. Sexual slavery also relied on secrecy without invisibility. People knew, they just did not speak. Everyone understood what happened behind palace walls, but acknowledgement threatened stability. So silence prevailed. This silence shaped social norms. Women outside palaces learned what power expected. Men learned what power permitted. Hierarchy extended beyond walls. This is why sexual slavery influenced gender roles broadly. It reinforced the idea that women's bodies existed for male authority. That consent was conditional. That power determined access. Even women who were never enslaved lived in the shadow of these systems. They learned caution. They learned obedience. They learned limits. The ripple effects were immense. They shaped marriage practices. They shaped inheritance laws. They shaped social expectations. The system extended far beyond its immediate victims. And yet history often isolates sexual slavery as a palace phenomenon, as if it were contained. It was not. It was structural. This structure also required ideology, not explicit, subtle. Ideas about foreignness justified capture. Ideas about hierarchy justified ownership. Ideas about gender justified access. Ideas about destiny justified inevitability. When ideas align with power, they feel natural. Questioning them feels dangerous. This is why abolition, when it eventually emerged, was resisted. Not because people suddenly became cruel, but because systems were threatened. Ending sexual slavery required more than moral awakening. It required dismantling economic incentives, social hierarchies, and political privileges. That is why it took so long. Even then, abolition was partial, selective, uneven, often replaced with new forms of exploitation. This continuity matters because it challenges comforting narratives of progress. The past did not end, it mutated. As we trace this system, we must also examine how masculinity was constructed. Powerful men were taught entitlement early. They learned that authority included access, that conquest included possession, that dominance included intimacy. These lessons were reinforced by peers, institutions, and tradition. Refusal to participate was seen as weakness. Excess was praised. Thus, sexual slavery was not merely tolerated, it was aspirational, a sign of success. This normalization is perhaps the most unsettling aspect, because it reveals how easily morality bends around power. The system also exploited class divisions. Poor women were more vulnerable. Women without protection were more vulnerable. Women without male guardians were more vulnerable. Vulnerability became opportunity for others. This intersection of gender and class intensified exploitation. Privilege insulated some. Marginalization consumed others. Understanding this intersection is critical because it reveals why some voices survived history and others vanished. The absence of voices is not accidental. It is the result of layered exclusion. Women denied education. Women denied property. Women denied legal standing. Silence was enforced structurally. When we search for testimonies and find few, we must ask why. The answer is not absence of suffering. It is absence of permission. This is why historians rely on indirect evidence. Legal codes, market records, architectural design. The system speaks even when victims could not. And what it says is clear. Sexual slavery was integrated, normalized, defended. As we continue this documentary, we will examine specific regions, laws, and practices, but the foundation remains the same. Power created demand. Demand created supply. Supply required violence. Violence required silence. This chain was unbroken for centuries, not because it was invisible, but because it was useful. Understanding usefulness is key. Systems persist because they serve interests. To dismantle them, interests must be challenged. This is not easy. It was not easy then. It is not easy now. But clarity is the first step. We are now fully inside the system. We have traced it from capture to court, from violence to routine, from coercion to normalization. What remains is to confront justification, the arguments that defended this system, the beliefs that sustained it, the rationalizations that allowed people to live with it. Belief is the quiet engine of every enduring system. Force can capture bodies, but belief captures minds. And once belief takes hold, violence no longer needs to announce itself. It becomes justified. It becomes explained. It becomes invisible. This is where sexual slavery truly sustained itself, not only through chains and markets, but through ideas that made ownership feel reasonable, even righteous. Empires did not say, "We are exploiting." They said, "This is order." They did not say, "We are violating." They said, "This is custom." They did not say, "These women have no choice." They said, "This is their place." Belief transformed cruelty into necessity, and necessity into virtue. Every empire developed narratives to explain why some people could be owned and others could not. Foreignness was one of the most powerful. Those from outside the empire were portrayed as lesser, uncivilized, dangerous, or impure. Their bodies, therefore, were not fully protected by moral obligation. Distance made dehumanization easier. Class reinforced this logic. The poor were described as naturally subordinate. Their suffering was framed as inevitable. Their vulnerability became proof of inferiority rather than evidence of injustice. When poverty is moralized, exploitation feels deserved. Gender completed the structure. Women were defined by dependence. Their worth was tied to obedience, purity, fertility, and availability. Autonomy was framed as disorder. Desire was framed as male entitlement. Within this framework, denying women control over their bodies felt natural. Belief did not need to be explicit. It lived in language. In proverbs, in laws, in rituals, in everyday assumptions. Children absorbed it before they could question it. This is how systems reproduce themselves, not through constant enforcement, but through normalization. Religious interpretation often played a role, not always as origin but as reinforcement. Sacred texts were selectively emphasized. Debates focused on regulation rather than abolition. Moral discomfort was redirected into procedural detail. The question became, how should this be done? Not should this exist. This redirection was powerful. It allowed people to feel ethical while participating in harm. Law followed belief. Legal systems codified ownership, defined status, established inheritance rules, determined punishments. Once written into law, exploitation gained legitimacy. Breaking the system became crime. Enduring it became duty. Custom reinforced law. What had always been done felt right simply because it had always been done. Tradition became shield. But tradition is not ancient wisdom. It is repeated choice. Empires also relied on comparison. They pointed to worse violence elsewhere. They argued that captivity within imperial households was safer, more civilized, more humane than chaos beyond borders. This comparison softened conscience. Better oppression felt like mercy. This argument appears again and again in history. It is one of the most effective defenses of exploitation. Belief also shaped how suffering was interpreted. Pain endured quietly was praised as virtue. Endurance was framed as strength. Silence was framed as dignity. Those who broke were blamed for weakness. This reframing protected the system from critique. When suffering is moralized, resistance becomes shameful. Another belief sustained the system: inevitability. People were taught that hierarchy was natural, that inequality was permanent, that nothing could be done. If something cannot be changed, questioning it feels pointless. Hopelessness is stabilizing. But inevitability is not truth. It is a story told by those who benefit. Sexual slavery also survived because it was fragmented. No single moment captured its full brutality. Capture happened in one place, transport in another, sale in another, use in another. Each stage could be rationalized separately. No one person felt responsible for the whole. Fragmentation protects systems. It allows participants to see themselves as small, powerless, or merely doing their job. I did not raid. I did not sell. I did not choose. I only followed rules. Responsibility dissolved. This diffusion of responsibility did not only protect perpetrators, it confused victims. When harm comes from everywhere and nowhere, blame becomes abstract. Anger loses direction. This is why systems of exploitation prefer complexity. Complexity obscures accountability. Over generations, belief hardened into identity. People did not just live under these systems, they identified with them. Status depended on participation. Honor depended on compliance. Power depended on silence. To challenge the system was to challenge oneself. This is why reform was so slow, not because cruelty was unseen, but because it was woven into meaning. Even when individuals felt discomfort, they lacked language to articulate it. Words to describe injustice were underdeveloped. Concepts like bodily autonomy, consent, universal dignity, these were not absent, but they were fragile, contested, and easily overridden. Language matters. What cannot be named struggles to be opposed. Meanwhile, the women inside these systems were subjected to another belief: gratitude. They were told they were lucky. Lucky to be chosen, lucky to be fed, lucky to be protected. Gratitude replaced justice. This inversion was cruel. It demanded emotional submission in addition to physical control. It required women to thank those who benefited from their captivity. Psychologically, this is devastating. It fractures self-perception. It creates confusion between survival and loyalty. Many women internalized blame. They believed their suffering was personal failure rather than systemic violence. Internalized blame is one of the most effective tools of control. It eliminates the need for constant enforcement. And yet, cracks existed. Belief was never total. Contradictions surfaced. Moral discomfort lingered. Debates occurred. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to prove inevitability was a lie. We know this because systems invested so much effort in defending themselves. Defenses are unnecessary when something is truly unquestioned. Stories were rewritten. Uncomfortable truths were omitted. Legends emphasized benevolence. History was curated. This curation shaped memory. Later generations inherited sanitized versions of the past. They admired rulers without confronting what sustained their power. They celebrated civilization without acknowledging its victims. This selective memory continues today. When modern audiences encounter stories of imperial courts, they are often drawn to intrigue, luxury, and spectacle. Rarely are they asked to sit with coercion. Entertainment prefers ambiguity. Ambiguity avoids responsibility. This documentary refuses ambiguity, not because the past is simple, but because exploitation is clear. We must also address the role of masculinity within these belief systems. Powerful men were taught that entitlement was proof of authority. Access to women signaled success. Restraint was weakness. This belief harmed men as well. It equated identity with domination. It discouraged empathy. It rewarded excess. But harm to perpetrators does not outweigh harm to victims. Understanding masculinity's role explains persistence. It does not excuse it. Belief systems also punished dissenters. Those who questioned practices risked ridicule, loss of status, or worse. Conformity was safer. Silence was rewarded. Over time, belief and fear merged. People stopped distinguishing between what was right and what was safe. Safety won. This merging is one of the most dangerous outcomes of prolonged injustice. When morality feels dangerous, injustice thrives. We must also confront the role of spectatorship. Many people were neither direct perpetrators nor direct victims. They knew. They benefited indirectly. They said nothing. Passive complicity sustained the system. History often absolves bystanders, but systems do not survive on leaders alone. They require acceptance. Understanding belief forces us to confront ourselves, not as descendants of perpetrators, but as inheritors of narratives. Which stories do we repeat uncritically? Which silences do we accept? Which comforts do we protect? This documentary does not accuse the past alone. It questions the present because belief is not historical, it is ongoing. When modern exploitation is explained away as economic necessity, when coercion is reframed as opportunity, when victims are blamed for vulnerability, we are witnessing the same logic. The forms change. The justification remains. This is why dismantling belief is harder than dismantling chains. Chains can be broken. Beliefs must be unlearned. Unlearning is uncomfortable. It destabilizes identity. It complicates pride. It demands humility. But without unlearning, systems simply return in new forms. As we move forward, the documentary will confront specific justifications used by empires. We will examine legal codes, religious debates, philosophical defenses, not to mock them, but to expose their function. Because once belief is understood as tool rather than truth, its power weakens. The women erased from history were not erased because they were insignificant. They were erased because their existence contradicted belief. They proved that empire was not benevolent. That order was not moral. That greatness had a cost. Erasure was necessary to preserve the story of power. We are now at a turning point in this narrative. We have examined capture, transport, markets, households, and belief. What remains is confrontation. Confrontation with contradiction. With the gap between ideals and reality. With the stories empires told and the lives they consumed. Responsibility is the point where stories begin to resist us. Because responsibility cannot be romanticized. It does not allow distance. It does not allow admiration without consequence. It does not allow us to hide behind time. Responsibility asks a simple question that history often avoids. who benefited and who paid? Empires answered this question without hesitation. They benefited. Others paid. And once this exchange was accepted as normal, everything else followed. One of the most effective ways responsibility was avoided was by reframing suffering as stability. Stability became the highest virtue. Anything that threatened order, rebellion, dissent, moral questioning, was treated as chaos, and chaos was feared more than injustice. This fear was cultivated deliberately. Empires exaggerated the dangers of disorder. They pointed to borderlands, to nomadic peoples, to failed states, and said, "This is what happens without control." And control, once accepted as necessary, justified almost anything. Sexual slavery was defended as part of this control. It was described as a way to regulate desire, to prevent unrest, to channel power safely. The bodies of women became instruments of social management. This logic is chilling but consistent. When human beings are reduced to functions, morality becomes optional. Responsibility was also deflected through hierarchy. Orders came from above. Blame flowed downward. Each layer claimed obedience. "I had no choice." This phrase appears in every oppressive system. It is rarely true, but it is always convenient. Those who carried out raids said they followed commands. Those who transported captives said they followed contracts. Those who sold said they followed markets. Those who owned said they followed tradition. Each step distanced itself from the whole. This fragmentation allowed people to live with themselves. It allowed them to see their actions as necessary rather than chosen. But necessity is often manufactured. The system also relied on comparison to excuse itself. Captivity within empire was contrasted with death in war. Ownership was framed as mercy. This false choice erased alternatives. Freedom was never offered as an option. This framing taught societies to accept lesser cruelty as kindness. Once this lesson is learned, exploitation becomes flexible. Another powerful deflection of responsibility was time. People believed that what had always existed must continue. Longevity became justification. If something endured centuries, it felt permanent. If it felt permanent, it felt inevitable. But inevitability is a story told by power to discourage resistance. History shows that systems change, not because they must, but because people force them to. Yet in the case of sexual slavery, resistance was especially difficult. Victims were isolated, communities were fractured, voices were silenced. The very people harmed most were least able to oppose it. This imbalance is crucial. Responsibility rested with those who had power, and those with power rarely relinquish it voluntarily. Empires also benefited from ambiguity. They avoided clear definitions. Was a concubine enslaved or protected? Was captivity cruel or benevolent? Was access exploitation or privilege? Ambiguity protected conscience. If something cannot be clearly defined, it cannot be clearly condemned. This ambiguity persists in how history remembers these systems. Language remains soft, neutral, detached. Words matter. Words determine what we feel. When violence is described clinically, it feels distant. When coercion is framed as arrangement, it feels mutual. Language does not just describe reality, it shapes it. The women inside these systems were rarely allowed language of their own. They did not define their experience. Others defined it for them. This theft of narrative was as powerful as physical captivity. When someone else tells your story, they decide what matters. They decide what is omitted. They decide what is remembered. History often remembers sexual slavery through the lens of rulers, through their desires, their anxieties, their households, rarely through the lens of those confined within them. This imbalance is not accidental. It preserves power's perspective. Responsibility also intersects with legacy. Empires wanted to be remembered for greatness. Acknowledging systemic sexual exploitation would tarnish that image, so it was minimized or aestheticized or ignored. This selective memory shaped education, it shaped art, it shaped national pride, and it shaped what later generations questioned or did not. The result is a historical gap. A gap where millions of lives should be. Filling this gap does not require inventing stories. It requires reading existing records differently. Legal codes that list ownership rights. Market records that list prices. Architectural designs that reveal surveillance. The system speaks, we just have to listen. When we listen carefully, a pattern emerges. Sexual slavery was not chaotic, it was predictable. Where conquest expanded, it followed. Where inequality deepened, it intensified. Where accountability weakened, it flourished. This predictability matters, because it means the system was not driven by individual depravity alone. It was driven by conditions. Change the conditions and behavior changes. Leave them intact and abuse returns. This insight is uncomfortable because it suggests that humanity is not immune to repetition. It suggests that moral progress is fragile. It requires maintenance. Responsibility, then, is not about condemnation. It is about vigilance. We must also confront the emotional toll of these systems, not just on victims, but on societies. Normalizing exploitation corrodes empathy. It teaches people to compartmentalize suffering. It teaches them to care selectively. Selective empathy is dangerous. It allows people to see themselves as moral while benefiting from harm. The women subjected to sexual slavery were not outside society. They were embedded within it. Their suffering was part of its functioning. Ignoring them distorts our understanding of the past. It also distorts our understanding of progress. Because progress measured only by power, territory, or art is incomplete. Progress must also be measured by whose humanity is recognized. This documentary insists on that measurement. As we move forward, we will confront moments where belief cracks, where systems face pressure, where contradictions become visible. These moments are important. They remind us that nothing is inevitable. Some people did question, some resisted, some recorded discomfort. Their voices were marginal, but they existed. Change does not begin with majority agreement, it begins with fracture. We will examine how fractures appeared, how debates emerged, how justifications weakened, how abolition, partial and flawed, became imaginable. But before that, we must understand the cost of silence fully. Silence did not only erase victims, it shaped the moral landscape. It taught societies what could be ignored. It set precedents. Once a society learns to ignore one group's suffering, it becomes easier to ignore another's. This is how exploitation expands. Sexual slavery was a testing ground. It revealed how far power could go without challenge. It established patterns that later systems would reuse. Understanding this lineage is essential. Because modern exploitation does not arise in a vacuum. It inherits tactics. It inherits beliefs. It inherits excuses. When we confront the past honestly, we equip ourselves to recognize the present. This is why responsibility matters, not as guilt, but as clarity. Clarity allows interruption. It allows us to say, this pattern ends here. The women whose lives were consumed by empire did not have that power. We do, but only if we refuse silence. As this documentary continues, we will move toward confrontation, toward moments where systems were challenged, toward the limits of justification. Choice is the element history tries hardest to erase, because once choice is acknowledged, inevitability collapses, and if inevitability collapses, responsibility stands exposed. Empires survived by convincing themselves and everyone beneath them that no alternative existed. That conquest was necessary. That hierarchy was natural. That domination was stabilizing. But beneath every claim of necessity was a decision, and decisions can be traced. Consider how often rulers spoke of order while manufacturing disorder. Wars created captives. Captives created markets. Markets created dependency. The instability they feared was the instability they produced. Sexual slavery did not prevent chaos. It redistributed it away from power onto the powerless. This redistribution is crucial because suffering was not eliminated. It was relocated. And relocation allowed those at the center to feel secure. When violence happens far away, it feels abstract. When it happens behind walls, it feels private. When it happens to people labeled as lesser, it feels permissible. Empires mastered all three. The women drawn into sexual slavery often disappeared in stages, first from their homes, then from their communities, then from records, then from memory. By the time history was written, their absence felt complete. But absence is not neutrality, it is outcome. Every historical narrative that celebrates empire without acknowledging this system participates in erasure. Not intentionally, but effectively. We must pause here and confront a difficult truth. Many people today feel admiration for empires of the past, for their architecture, their art, their governance. This admiration is understandable, but it is incomplete. Admiration without reckoning turns history into myth, and myth protects power. Reckoning does not require rejecting all achievements. It requires seeing them fully, seeing what made them possible, seeing who paid. Sexual slavery was not incidental to empire. It was integrated into its logic. It reinforced hierarchy. It rewarded conquest. It satisfied entitlement. Removing it would have required dismantling core assumptions about power. That is why it persisted. And that is why, when cracks finally appeared, they appeared slowly. Not as sudden moral revolutions, but as gradual discomfort. Some people began to question excess. Others questioned inheritance. Some worried about stability. Rarely did they center the humanity of the enslaved. Concern often emerged only when exploitation threatened order. This pattern is revealing. Change was often driven not by empathy, but by self-interest. Even abolition, when it came, was often partial. It addressed certain forms of slavery while leaving others intact. It replaced ownership with dependency. It changed language before changing reality. This should temper any triumphalism. Progress is uneven and often compromised. The legacy of sexual slavery did not vanish when laws changed. It lingered in attitudes, in expectations, in gender roles, in silence. Many societies that formally abolished slavery retained deep inequalities shaped by centuries of exploitation. The legal system moved faster than culture. Culture moved faster than memory. Memory often lagged behind truth. This lag matters Because unresolved history shapes present behavior. When people do not understand how inequality was produced, they mistake it for natural. When suffering is disconnected from its cause, it feels random. And when injustice feels random, it feels unsolvable. Understanding sexual slavery as system, not aberration, changes this. It reveals design, and design can be dismantled, but dismantling requires honesty, not comfort. One of the most persistent myths is that cruelty belonged to the past, while enlightenment belongs to the present. This myth is seductive. It flatters us. It suggests we are morally superior, but superiority is dangerous. It blinds us to repetition. The structures that enabled sexual slavery, vulnerability, inequality, displacement, concentrated power still exist. They appear in new forms. They operate under new names. They rely on the same logic. This does not mean history is meaningless. It means history is unfinished. The women erased from imperial systems were not passive victims of fate. They were active participants in survival. Their lives were shaped by choices they did not make, but they navigated those choices with intelligence, resilience, and humanity. Reducing them to symbols of suffering does them no justice. They were complex. They adapted. They resisted when possible. They endured. Endurance should not be romanticized. It should be respected. History often praises resilience because it avoids confronting why resilience was necessary. We must also confront how sexual slavery distorted relationships beyond the palace. It reshaped marriage norms. It normalized male entitlement. It reinforced female subordination. These effects rippled outward. Women outside these systems learned caution. They learned that protection depended on proximity to power. They learned that refusal could be dangerous. These lessons shaped generations. Men learned entitlement. They learned that access could be claimed. They learned that power extended into intimacy. These lessons shaped generations too. The system did not only harm those inside it, it shaped society itself. This is why sexual slavery cannot be isolated as a niche topic. It is central to understanding empire. And empire is central to understanding modernity. Empires shaped borders. Borders shaped nations. Nations inherited institutions built under imperial logic. The past is not gone, it is embedded. As we continue this documentary, we will move closer to moments of rupture, moments where belief faltered, where justification weakened, where silence cracked. These moments are important not because they redeem the past, but because they reveal possibility. Possibility is what systems fear most. When people begin to imagine alternatives, inevitability collapses. When inevitability collapses, power must defend itself more aggressively. This is when repression intensifies. This is when narratives harden. The resistance to change often reveals how threatened a system feels. Sexual slavery was defended most fiercely when it was questioned, not when it was unexamined. This tells us something vital. Silence protected the system. Speech endangered it. That is why voices were suppressed. That is why records are scarce. That is why memory was curated. This documentary exists because silence is no longer sufficient. We do not tell this story to accuse the past. We tell it to understand the mechanisms that still shape our world. History does not ask us to feel guilty. It asks us to be attentive. Attention is responsibility. As we approach the next phase of this narrative, we will confront the slow unraveling of justification. We will examine where belief systems fractured, where contradictions became too visible to ignore. This unraveling was not clean, it was contested, it was uneven, and it was incomplete, but it proves something essential: what was built by choice can be challenged by choice. The women erased by empire did not live to see that challenge, but their lives made it necessary. And now we reach the end of this part of the story. Not the end of the history, not the end of the suffering, but the end of our descent into silence. What we have uncovered here is not a hidden secret. It is something far more unsettling. It is something that was always visible, but rarely confronted. Sexual slavery did not survive because people did not know. It survived because people learned how not to look. They learned how to admire power without asking how it was sustained, how to celebrate civilization without naming its costs, how to inherit greatness without inheriting responsibility. And that silence echoed for centuries. If you have watched this far, then you have already done something rare. You did not turn away when the story became uncomfortable. You did not ask for simplicity when the truth was complex. You stayed. That matters, because attention is the first thing systems of exploitation try to destroy. History does not change when people feel shocked. It changes when people understand. And understanding begins with listening, especially to the voices that were never allowed to speak. This documentary is not asking you to feel guilt for the past. It is asking you to recognize patterns, to see how power operates, to notice how silence is built, protected, and inherited. Because once you recognize a pattern, you can interrupt it. The women erased by empire cannot speak for themselves, but their absence speaks loudly if we are willing to hear it. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe history should be told honestly, and if you want to continue this journey into the structures that shaped our world, please subscribe to this channel. Your support allows us to keep telling the stories that were buried, softened, or ignored. And if you have watched this video all the way to the end, leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Not just your country, but your space, your time, your moment. Because history connects us across borders and voices matter most when they answer silence together. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening. And we will continue.